I would like to ask all of our children, if you're watching, would you gather it a little closer and help me out with something? I'm going to start this morning with a book that you probably know. It's called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. And I need your help as we go through some of the motions. It goes, we're going on a bear hunt. We're going to catch a big one. It's a beautiful day. We're not scared. But then what happens? We come to the tall grass that's taller than we are. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. We gotta go through it. So are you ready? Swish, swash, swish, swash. And then what happens? We come to the mud, the sticky, ooey, gooey mud. And we gotta go through it. Are you ready? Squish, squash, squish, squash. We come to a river and have to swim through. And then we come to the deep, dark forest. Can't go over it. Can't go under it. We gotta go through it. Stumble, trip, stumble, trip, stumble, trip. And then, of course, in the book, we get to see the bear, and once we get there, well, that's a little more frightening than we thought, and we race all the way home. But the fun part of this book is not seeing the bear. No, the fun part of this book is the journey. It's going through the grass and the mud and the forest and the water. This is a book that's all about the journey. I don't know about you, but sometimes it feels like the journey that we are on right now is a lot like that bear hunt. I mean, did you wake up this morning and see the sunshine? Boy, I did. I looked out my window and I said, it's a beautiful day. I'm not scared. And then what happens? Well, I find myself in the tall grass of confusing information. I find myself in the weeds of mixed messages about what we should and should not be doing. I saw this video. I want to share it with you. I think it sort of brings that home to us.
Yeah, I really don't understand why everybody isn't following the same rules right now. They're very clear, so let's take a minute and let's go over them again. First, you must not leave the house for any reason, unless of course you have a reason, and then you may leave the house. All stores are closed except those that are open, and all stores must close unless of course they need to stay open. This virus is deadly, but don't be afraid of it. It can only kill people who are vulnerable and also those who are not vulnerable. We should stay locked down until the virus stops infecting people. And it will only stop infecting people if enough of us get infected that we build immunity. So it is very important that we get infected and also do not get infected. You should not go to the doctor's office or the hospital unless you have to go there. Unless, of course, you are too sick to go there. This virus has no effect on children except for those children in which it affects. The virus remains active on different surfaces for 2 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours, but in most cases it's days and not hours, and it needs a damp environment or a cold environment that is warm and dry in the air, unless the air is plastic.
That was Adley Stump. She is a singer and entertainer out of Nashville, and I think she does a great job of sort of capturing the spirit of the tall grass. But we sometimes find ourselves trapped inside. But hey, it's a beautiful day. We're not scared. But then we wake up and find, well, we are where we were yesterday. I look around the walls of my house, and like many of you, I have been at my house for about 5 weeks now. And if we're not careful, we find ourselves stuck in the mud of sameness. It's kind of like Groundhog's Day, right? You remember the movie with Bill Murray where he lives the same day over and over again? There's that great scene in the movie where every morning it starts out, his alarm goes off, and the radio comes on, and that same song is playing every morning, Sonny and Cher. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do-do. I got you, babe. I got you, babe. Sometimes I walk through my house, and it's like those walls are singing that. I got you, babe. Because you can't go anywhere. And we can't. And it feels like sometimes we are stuck in that mud. And you know what? We can't go over it. And people, we can't go under it. We got to go through it. And as we go through it, we find ourselves, yeah, it's a beautiful day. It is. And we try not to be scared. But we find ourselves on the edge of that deep, dark forest of fear. It's the forest of fear. What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to the world, to the economy? Oh, there's so many questions that can stir up those fears in us. And yes, I'm going to say it again. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. People, we got to go through it. But aren't you glad we get to go through it together? And aren't you glad we get to go through it with our God? Because we got to go through it. And yeah, we will stumble, trip our way right through it. It is the journey that we're on today. And in many ways, this journey will define us as individuals, as a society. Yeah, as we stumble, trip our way through this, we will find out really who we are. But let's know whose we are all along the way. You know, that's why today we are really looking at this journey out of the New Testament. It's called the Walk to Emmaus, right? So what is Emmaus? What's so important about this walk to Emmaus? Well, Emmaus is kind of like the bear. It is not an important part of the story. Where they were going is very insignificant to this. It's a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem. We find 2 disciples walking to this town. We don't know if they're walking home. We don't know if they're walking there for some other reason. It doesn't matter. That's uneventful. This isn't an uneventful thing. It's an everyday thing for these 2 disciples. They've probably done that walk 100 times between Jerusalem and Emmaus. But these 2 disciples on this journey this journey becomes the very symbol of spiritual renewal and experiencing Christ. In our world today, in our lives, when we say walk to Emmaus, most people skip right past the scripture and go to what it means today. Walk to Emmaus refers to a 3-day experience that we have in our society. You can sign up for it and go and do it. It's 3 days. Sometimes it's outside, sometimes it's inside. But it's an experience that is designed to provide a space for us to meet Christ in a new way. It's designed to help us feel God's grace revealed to us in new experiences. And it is powerful. Walk to Emmaus is a powerful tool for discipleship, for modern discipleship. So what happened on this original walk out of the New Testament that makes it so important? 2 disciples. We don't even know who they are. I mean, we know one of them is Cleopas. The second one is not named. You know, some people think it was probably his wife. Often women weren't named. But we have 2 disciples, and it doesn't matter who they are. They're walking on this road to Emmaus, and they are just filled with excitement. I mean, they are just chattering about what's happened. You see, they have been to Jerusalem. They have witnessed the arrest, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus. They have seen his body put into the tomb, and then they hear the body's missing. And there are these crazy stories that Christ has come back to life. And they are talking about it, and they are so excited. They're trying to process all of this information. And a man just walks up and joins in. Now, they don't know who he is. We know that man is Jesus. One of the things that strikes me about this story, quite honestly, is how normal it is, how everyday it is. 2 disciples are walking down the road, and Jesus jumps into their conversation. You know, he says, "Hey, what are you guys talking about?" And they look at him like he's crazy. Where have you been? You don't know what just happened in Jerusalem? I want you to imagine for a moment that you're on a Zoom call. Maybe you're in one of our grow groups and you're doing the Zoom call, and we're all talking about, we're into that COVID-19 conversation that we have every week and that we're all having all the time, and we're into that, and a stranger pops onto the Zoom call and he says, "Hey, what's everybody talking about tonight?" And we say, "What, are you crazy? Where have you been for the last 4 months?" Of course, we're talking about the coronavirus, COVID-19, and the economy, the effect that all of this is having on the economy. Where have you been? That's exactly what happened on this walk to Emmaus. They're talking about what happened in Jerusalem a stranger comes up and starts walking with them. Who is this guy? Who is this guy who doesn't know what's happened in the world around him? But Jesus begins to explain the scriptures to them. And while they would have thought as disciples, they would have known the scriptures. And yet, they didn't get it. They hadn't really gotten a grasp. They hadn't put their minds around what exactly had happened and what they do with that. Remember, Jesus had set sort of a new standard for his disciples. It wasn't sort of the same old rules that they had known before Jesus, where you just memorize the scriptures and you learn those and you're good. No, Jesus set a whole new standard. He said, you'll be known as my disciples by how well you love each other. You'll be known as disciples of mine when you take care of those around you. I want to go back to the part of the story, though, where they don't recognize Jesus, because I will tell you, I have spent a lot of time thinking about this and praying about this week. And I think it's important. I do. Jesus is not a spirit. He's not a ghost. They're not frightened of him. It's a man who just comes with them on their walk. He's a physical being, but he is not the same. From the very moment of resurrection, think about this. Think about Jesus when he meets Mary Magdalene. Those who are closest to him did not recognize him. The resurrected Jesus is physical. He's physical. But the resurrected Jesus is physically different. Different enough that people don't recognize him, those people who knew him and loved him. I mean, he's physical. I mean, he shows doubting Thomas his hands and his feet. There is a physicality there, and yet, time and time again, he is not recognized. The Easter story tells us that Jesus conquers death. Jesus conquers death, and God begins this whole process of healing the world and rescuing the world. In resurrection, he begins this new creation. And while it is rooted in the physical, a physical man is walking on the road to Emmaus. It is rooted in the physical, it is still different. It's new creation. As we experience resurrection, we begin to see new creation all around us, inside us, with us. Not in some ethereal, spiritual, ghostly way, but in real life and real people. Now back to the disciples on the road. They're talking to Christ. They don't know it, but they are engaged and entranced by it. Later they would say, weren't our hearts on fire when we were listening to him? John Wesley would say his heart was strangely warmed. Weren't our hearts on fire? When we learn to see Christ in our everyday, those everyday experiences become holy. And they literally light that fire inside of us. So what happened at the end of the story? Well, they invite Jesus to come in for dinner. He does, and as he breaks the bread, they know who he is. They recognize him. And then what? Well, they're tired, right? They've been walking all day. They must be tired. And yet, they race back to Jerusalem to tell everybody what they've experienced. That's what happens. When we learn to see Christ all around us in our everyday experiences, it is life-changing. And we got to share it. And we got to tell about it. Often though, when we come to see Christ in an experience that we've had, we see it past. It's hard to see in the present moment, at least it is for me. Often I will see something, I will think about something that's happened, and I'll think, wow, that was the Christ moment. We look back in a moment and we see that we were in divine presence. But sometimes it takes that. You see, I found myself this week on a couple of phone calls that, well, I didn't think anything about it when I was having them, but I look back on them and see the divine. One of them was with Nancy Lorenz. Nancy Lorenz has been in our church for a long time, part of the Saturday service. Nancy's been battling cancer for a while now, and in her chemotherapy a few weeks ago, she needed to go to the hospital. She was having some trouble, and in the midst of the pandemic, the first hospital turned her away. They didn't have room for her. She finally found a hospital and ended up in a rehab place. But when I talked to her a few days ago, she was home. She was home and full of life and full of spirit. She sounded so good. And I can tell you, we did not talk about Jesus. We didn't. We talked about her dog, Remy. We talked about my two dogs, Toby and Kiwi. We talked about what she was having for dinner and how the neighbors were going to bring it to her. It was everyday stuff. But in her voice, wow, I heard the strength and the confidence of a woman who was hopeful. And as I look back on it, I said, yeah, those moments on the phone, that's how we walked today, right? We walked together on the phone. As she and I walked through all these daily, insignificant things that are happening in our lives, it was holy. It was sacred. A few days ago, I called a friend of mine who lives in Italy. Her name is Alessandra. Alessandra battles MS, so I knew she was at high risk as COVID tore through Italy. And I hadn't heard from her for a while, so I was very worried. And sure enough, she had been battling the virus. But I called her for her birthday, and she said, you know, I've recovered. It was a light case, and I have recovered. And for my birthday, it was the best birthday I think I've ever had. My husband and my son took me out into our garden. They put our chairs in the garden, and she said, we just sat there and talked. And she said, you know, somebody forgot to tell the birds and the flowers and all the grapes in the vineyard that there's some pandemic going on, because they are doing what they always do. It could have been any day. It was a typical, beautiful spring day on the Italian hillside. And as a birthday gift, her son learned to play her favorite song, Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. And he played that song for her there in the garden. And I'll tell you, she took some time, as she does, and she described it to me in great detail, sitting in the garden, hearing the song. And not only was that moment holy for her, it was sacred for the two of us as we relived it and talked about it and walked through it, because once again, I heard joy. I heard hope. And that is Christ. That, my friends, is Christ. You know, as we continue our journey, well, it's a walk to Emmaus, right? In many ways, it is the walk to Emmaus. We walk and we try to find Christ and God and all of the experiences around us, but sometimes it is true, it feels like the bear hunt. It's a beautiful day. We're not scared. So let's try not to get lost in the weeds. Let's try not to get into that high grass of information overload. Let's try not to get stuck into the muck of quarantine, because we do find ourselves at every point, at some point at least, at some point, we find ourselves in that deep, dark forest of fear. I will say it one more time. We can't go over it. We can't go under it. We got to go through it. We got to go through it. We got to stumble, trip our way through it. We can do it together. And we know that Christ meets us in that forest, on that road, as we stumble and as we trip, wherever that road leads. In the tall grass, in the mud, especially in the fear, in that forest of fear, Jesus is there. And as we stumble and trip, he calls our name. He calls your name and mine. And he says, rise up. Walk with me. Let's process this together. Let's walk on that road to Emmaus together.